This is a story about the last military action of an aircraft carrier called the USS Saratoga in World War II. I started into this project primarily for my own amusement, but as I got into it, I realized that a friend and shipmate of mine, Tom Shelworth, who now lives in Atherton, California with his wife Lois, might be interested, and also perhaps our children and grandchildren, since this is, after all, a small part of history. To go back to the beginning, when I went to college in 1941, my dad, who flew as a rear seat observer in France in World War I, said, "Sonny, you might as well go train to be an officer because it's a lot better that way, and we're going to be in a war soon." Well, I did sign up in the NROTC. Dad turned out to be right because less than 3 months later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, Tom and I and another friend, Jack Cummings, who was a classmate at RPI, joined the Saratoga in the Indian Ocean in 1944. The Saratoga was operating as part of a Far Eastern fleet comprised of U.S., British, Australian, Dutch, and French ships. We got there just in time to steam north and conduct an attack on the cities of Surabaya and Sabang on the islands of Java and Sumatra. Pilots did a good job. They knocked out a large portion of the Japanese fuel reserves. We on board ship never heard a shot fired. Then the ship went back to the United States for modernization and before reassignment into the Pacific. Now, about a year later, we were with Task Force 58 off the coast of Japan, where our pilots raided the vicinity of Tokyo. Again, we never heard a shot fired because the fighter planes were effective in keeping the Japanese planes away from us. After a few days of that, the Sara was detached along with the light carrier Bismarck C and the battlecruiser Alaska to support the invasion of a then little-known island that happened to be Iwo Jima. We steamed south and joined in the support of Iwo Jima in the early days. What the Marines went through on Iwo Jima is now part of Marine history, losing over 7,000 men dead and 13 or 14,000 wounded. It was a horrendous battle. All 25 to 30,000 of the Japanese troops on the island were killed. Well, there may have been a few survivors, but not many. It was a bad scene. The carrier action offshore in support of this, in a sense, was a sideshow to the Iwo Jima operation. But to those of us who were on board, it was a little bit more than a sideshow. Now, I had just come off watch and had turned into my bunk for a little rest when the general quarters alarm sounded. I thought, well, another false alarm, I'll just stay here for a while. But then I thought I'd better of it, so I joined my crew. My assignment was as gun captain on a battery of 40 millimeter quad anti-aircraft guns. I had a pointer named Blazewski and a range setter whose name I can't remember. We got to know each other pretty well standing in that little gun director's tub together. In any event, I just got there, climbed into the tub with the guys, and started looking around, and I saw 2 Japanese Zeros in a steep dive towards the ship. They were firing their machine guns and cannon as they came in, and all happened very fast. There were some guns opened up on the starboard side of the ship, nicked one of these planes, set one of the wings on fire, but they both came in and hit the ship. One on the bow, where it took very many casualties in the flight deck crew, the plane captains, and virtually wiped out Battery 1. The other one plowed into the starboard side of the ship and punched a hole through into the hangar deck area, and I'll talk more about that later. This was the Japanese first use of the kamikaze, and as you'll see from the effectiveness in this action, and as you'll remember from the effectiveness off Okinawa, it was a horrendously successful weapon. If they hadn't run out of planes and pilots, I'm not sure what additional damage they might have done. Now, the films that I'm about to narrate for you, I only became aware of their existence about 6 months ago. I happened to be watching a World War II reprise on television, and I saw a glimpse of a burning ship, which I recognized as the Saratoga. Now, in all the 50 years since that battle, I'd never seen anything in the war films of the Saratoga. But at that point, I said, gee, I wonder if I could get hold of those. To make a long story short, I went through the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and after about a 4 months effort, I got them to dig these old clips out and put them on videotape for me. And I will now attempt to narrate them for you. Tom, you told me once that you watched this battle in terms of rangefinders and gun control central coming to zero at the impact of these planes. So some of these pictures will be, maybe all of them will be pretty new to you. And as I go through, I'll try to introduce a few anecdotes which I remember, hadn't thought about for years, but which came back to me as I watched the film. So if we can have the film now, we'll get started, and I hope you get something out of this. Although we took quite a pasting that day, one must remember that the Marines did win the Battle of Iwo Jima, and there are good lessons to be learned even from temporary defeats. This is a view of the forward portion of the flight deck immediately after we took those first hits. This film was in bad shape and very difficult to copy, so you may see some momentary pauses and breaks because that's the problem they had. This is in the lower right-hand portion is a flight deck crane and the wreckage of an F-6F Hellcat. We took a direct hit on that. As a matter of fact, Chief Warrant Officer Brown was under that crane. Continuing to fight the fire here. This was very soon after the hit. Battery 1 was virtually totally wiped out, and there were heavy casualties among the crew on the flight deck who were trying to launch those few planes. We didn't get any planes off. There was suddenly another hit on the port side. It happened so fast the camera barely caught a flash of plane as it came in. Moon Miller, a friend of ours, a Marine captain I believe he was at the time, won the Silver Star for his firefighting efforts on Battery 2. These are just more scenes of firefighting efforts on the ship. They went on for a long, long period of time. This was one of our accompanying destroyers maneuvering in an attempt to lay anti-aircraft fire on the attacking planes. That's a picture of the Saratoga from one of the accompanying destroyers before it was hit. Here a destroyer has come very close to return a downed flyer to us. I believe this was after the battle, actually. These films are not in real sequence, and I've made no attempt to order them on the correct time frame. This patch on the right-hand side, you see a black patch near the waterline. One of the first two kamikazes hit directly on that spot and blasted a hole into the side of the ship. As a matter of fact, it blasted directly into our engineering compartment on the hangar deck, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later in this sequence. Another thing to note here is that the after portion of the flight deck was crowded with planes. These were all fueled and armed with bombs and rockets. If we'd been hit there, it probably would have, or may well have, sunk the ship. It certainly would have done away with yours truly. As you'll see later, I was positioned right there. Another transfer. This is called a breeches buoy. Another picture of the Saratoga from one of the destroyers after we took our first hits. The smoke is beginning to be visible on the flight deck from the hits. Saratoga, by the way, was the third carrier ever built by this country, CV-3. It performed extremely well in the early stages of the war. It was one of the few carriers we had, as a matter of fact. It was torpedoed twice, but never before bombed from the air. You can see the fire growing on the forward portion of the flight deck and the smoke pretty much enveloping the ship. The ship developed a list to starboard, a substantial list, because one of the boiler rooms was flooded from that hit on the side. At least I think it was from that hit. I'm not positive of that. These are some views of night attacks now. At the end of that same day, there's sporadic firing of the 40 millimeters. I believe you'll see a plane hit and go down. We shot down about 7 planes. We actually were hit by 5 kamikazes and 2 bombs. There's a plane went down. You can see it burning. That plane went into the water right in front of my gun crew about 200 yards out. I still remember it coming in because it was a twin-engine Betty. Most of the other attackers were single-engine planes. This particular sequence shows pretty much of nothing. It seems to have been overexposed, but we'll be through it in just a few seconds here. This smiling gentleman I don't recognize, but I certainly don't know what he had to smile about. We got very few of our planes up on combat air patrol, actually only 3, I believe. And there's a sad story that goes along with that, because the captain refused to recognize that the 17 to 25 planes picked up on radar were Japanese. He said they must be our planes without their IFF, or identification friend or foe, turned on. And so we sat there fat, dumb, and happy till we were hit. The only reason we got any planes into the air was the navigator told the captain if he didn't launch, he would override the captain. So they did get a few up, but they didn't stop the Japanese very well. We actually lost all of our aircraft in this action. This is a view, again, this is looking aft. The fire is forward. You're just seeing the smoke over the aft flight deck. My station was just on the right side by that last airplane, or first airplane on the right. Another view of the fire forward. Right after those hits and a brief lull in the attack, I went up to see if I could help do anything in fighting the fire. I wasn't able to, but I did stumble across an old friend who'd been burned to death, and that was somewhat of a shock to me. That's the area where Moon Miller was burned trying to save his crew and won the Silver Star. More firing at night. That doesn't begin to depict the amount of tracer fire that we threw up when we were really in the midst of it. We had 105 barrels of anti-aircraft guns on board, and that sometimes about half of them were firing at once. The Bismarck Sea off our port beam also put up a huge amount of fire. The Bismarck Sea was also struck by kamikazes. Their fuel supply was set on fire. Oh, I'll pause just a minute. That's our Captain Mobus putting anti-flash burn cream on his face. In reward for his massive piece of bad judgment in not launching a combat air patrol, he was promoted to admiral and returned to the United States to head up the Naval Air Training Command. Fires are to a large extent out here. They're still helping some of the wounded off. You can begin to see the damage that was done to the flight deck. There's more of this later. One of the bombs blasted a hole 5 decks down through 5 decks of steel. There's a sequence here now that depicts the fueling of the Saratoga from a tanker. Carriers, of course, all the ships were crucially dependent on the tanker support. I never envied the tanker crews because they were somewhat sitting ducks for Japanese submarines. You can see the fuel lines are hauled across. It's a somewhat tricky operation in rough seas. This was not a rough sea particularly. I think this probably occurred the day after the attack, where the Saratoga was fueled in order to go to Eniwetok for temporary repairs and then on to Pearl Harbor and Bremerton in the Seattle area. I believe there's a destroyer taking on fuel on the other side of the tanker at the same time we took it on. We had 3 destroyers with us on this assignment. There it is. I started to tell you about the Bismarck Sea, which during the night action was set on fire. It burned right off our port beam about 10 miles off and sank with the loss of over 500 men. Before it sank, it shot down 6 or 7 Japanese planes, but in sinking it lost all its own aircraft, and of course a lot of people. I don't know how many were wounded in that action, but the death toll was high. There's a destroyer alongside, bouncing up and down. I think it's transfer of mail, actually, which was a very important function on these ships. The sailors, all of us, lived for letters from home, and the constant topic of conversation was home, loved ones, families, girlfriends, and so forth. They were just ordinary guys, almost all volunteers. World War II, we didn't really need much of a draft because everyone was quick to sign up and try to do his or her part. This is the Bismarck Sea, I believe, which was sunk the same night we were attacked. Now these crewmen are sitting around on a damaged F-6F. It looks in pretty good shape, but actually our own cannon firing right across the top of these airplanes crushed their fuselages. This is the F-6F you saw in the early fires, sitting on the starboard side by the flight deck crane. As I mentioned, Brownie had gone under that crane, as he always said he would, for protection. It took a direct hit. Brownie's brother was also part of my crew, and that was a very difficult scene the next day, talking to him. I don't know what we're looking at here, but in a moment we'll be off this scene. Now this is a hole in the flight deck that went down 5 decks. And right next to our bunk room, by the way. The one I almost stayed in was burned out. So it's a good thing I got up and went to my post. Cleaning up some of the junk on deck the next day. As I mentioned earlier, virtually all of the hits, except for the hit in the side of the ship, were on the forward part of the flight deck. The Japanese really missed an opportunity. If they'd crashed in the aft part of the flight deck, it would have been even worse. I do recall one plane coming in on the bow and dropping a bomb on the bow and flying down the length of the flight deck right over top of the planes parked at the rear. I guess he chose not to die for the Emperor that day, but I doubt if he made it back to any place. They're just trying to get this wreck over the side, and later on we dumped a lot of aircraft that really looked in pretty good shape but weren't over the side. There was no way to take them off. I think we took 1 or 2 off in the best condition to the rear, but my memory's vague on that point. These are more views of the damaged flight deck. This is the picture of the bridge with, I believe another picture shows some shrapnel damage on the bridge, but it wasn't badly damaged. The guns you see between the structures there are the type of guns that I was in charge of. My job was to tell the pointer and range setter when to shoot and what to shoot at. My main job on the ship was aircraft maintenance. I had a crew of flight deck plane captains and mechanics. These are the 5-inch 38 anti-aircraft guns. We had 16 of them, and they were the ones that during the night attack, and you'll see some blasts of them later, fired directly across our heads and crushed the fuselages of airplanes. I think we'd have all lost our eardrums in that position were it not for the fact that we had earphones on. The noise was unbelievable. The noise itself was scary, let alone the attacking aircraft. It's a portion of the flight deck that heaved up from one of the bombs. The battlecruiser Alaska, and here's the Bismarck Sea again. The Alaska, shown again here, sustained no damage to the best of my knowledge. It was sort of like a small battleship. Here's that same old carcass of an F-6F Hellcat. I think maybe in this sequence we'll finally see it go over the side. I don't really know what happened to the pilots who were sitting in those planes trying to take off, but I imagine they were lost. I don't know whether those are parts of our aircraft or the Japanese aircraft. I do remember one chunk about that size flying back and hitting me on the helmet, and for a long time I saved a little piece of what was a red Japanese meatball. But that's lost in the years now. There's damage to the bridge, but no one on the bridge was injured. At the right there is what's left of the aircraft crane, the deck crane under which Brownie was killed. There's some extended scenes here of the burial ceremonies. We lost a total of about 150 men killed and a couple of hundred wounded. The burial ceremonies were simple. There was a salute fired from the Marine gunners, and the bodies were dumped into the sea. As I said before, these were just ordinary guys who mostly wanted to get the war over with and get home, but not this way. A couple of personal remembrances, Tom, which you might remember something about too. Remember Buckley, the catapult officer? We called him Buck. He was a very popular officer, and he, I believe, taught physical education, had a wife and kids. He was caught in the fire and burned to death, and he was the one I came across when I went up to see if I could help. The only thing left on Buck was his shoes. He must have been right in the middle of the fire. Connie Bevere, whom you may not have known, was a lieutenant who worked with me with the flight deck maintenance. Connie was sort of a spoiled guy. He was a little older than I was and not trained to do very much, but he always wanted to do something very well. And he kept volunteering for jobs, and we were always afraid to give him these assignments for fear he'd mess it up and then we'd be held responsible. They found Connie in the midst of that fire which you saw earlier. He'd had a leg blown off and he was burned. And when they went to pick him up, the medical corpsman, he said, "No, you take these other men first. They're probably worse than I am." By the time they got around to Connie and got him down to the operating room, he died. So in a sense, he finally did something very well indeed. And we all were proud of him for it. A dozen of these men I stumbled across in the following way. During a lull right after the first hits, I was sent by the air officer down below decks to inspect the hangar deck and see what was left, because we'd had horrendous fires on the hangar deck. I had to go down in the pitch dark with a small flashlight, undogging or opening hatches as I went and closing them behind me because we were still at general quarters. I got down there, the hangar deck was a total disaster. Every aircraft was burned to a skeleton. So I went over to our engineering shack and opened the hatch and peered in, and the first thing I saw was a horizon and stars. The kamikaze that had hit in the side of the ship that I mentioned earlier, you saw the black patch where they'd fixed it, had punched a hole directly into our office. And there were 12 of our men who had crowded in there for safety. They were all dead in a pile on the floor. So I simply closed up the hatch and went back and reported what I'd found. The fire on the hangar deck, I thought at one time had been started by that hit, but it's probably more likely it was started by raw gasoline pouring down the elevator and igniting the hangar deck. Peter Annabelle won the Navy Cross for attempting to and successfully controlling the fires on the hangar deck. Warrant Officer St. Clair won the Navy Cross for going over the side of the ship during action and helping to put that patch that I showed you earlier on the side of the ship. As I said, Moon Miller won his Silver Star trying to save the lives of his Marine gunners in Battery 2. There were plenty of acts of courage. I did not do anything courageous or even particularly noteworthy. Like most of the others, I did the best job I could, as we all did under the circumstances. It's interesting to tote up the scorecard. The Japanese expended about 25 airplanes to sink the Bismarck Sea, to put the Saratoga out of action, to destroy about 130 airplanes, to kill probably 700 men and wound twice that. The kamikaze was a very effective weapon, and you've got to give those Japanese pilots credit for courage. Sometimes people say, well, they were fanatics. It's hard to distinguish between fanaticism and courage. They were courageous. But so were our guys, and certainly the Marines on Iwo Jima who charged into fire and took up to 80% casualties and kept fighting had the same kind of courage the Japanese pilots did. And reflecting back on it after 50 years, it gives one pause to think of those who gave their lives for their country. And of course hope that this sort of thing can be avoided, although we keep stumbling into wars of one sort or another. I think if we got in this situation again, we'd find the youth of our country would rise to the occasion even though sometimes we older people despair of some of the antics that go on. This is a great country and worth fighting for. Well, although we took a lot of losses, as you can see, there were plenty of survivors. The full crew of the Saratoga under wartime conditions approached 5,000 men. These burial ceremonies were the day after the attack. I probably should have edited some of these scenes out, but you can always put it on fast forward. For me, it's a time to think. You can see the Marines firing their salute. One little story I neglected to tell earlier. When I was down on the hangar deck after a lull in the battle and found our dead crew in the engineering office, I got trapped down there. There was another general quarters and we were trapped below, and I ended up in a line in the dark with about 30 other sailors trying to get out. The only way I got out is I felt a little breath of fresh air and went over to a small hole and called up and asked where it went. It turned out that it was an ammunition passing chute, and I asked the people on the deck, can I get through that? And they said, no sir, that's just for ammunition. I got through it. There's some more scenes. There's a plane just shot down. See the smoke in the water. And see some of the tracers register on the film and others don't. We could see what we were shooting at in the dusk, but when it got dark, we just couldn't, and often we just had to fire in the general direction that the 5-inch were shooting, because they were under radar control. Tom, you may recognize the officer who just removed his hat as George Cullender. George and his wife, Theone, had the room above us in Bremerton, and Bev and I used to get a chuckle because they were always apologizing to us because their bed springs were too noisy. Now, right behind that smoke, by that aircraft in the upper left-hand corner, was my station. You'll see it better in a few minutes. I think, Tom, I also recognize Bill Funston. This must be Sky Aft. But you'd know more about that than I would. Isn't that Funston right there? Sky Aft was a gunnery station that directed fire control. The aircraft that you can see very dimly in the lower right-hand corner is the one that was parked right above our gun director's tub. Interestingly enough, it had 4 5-inch rockets pointing on the left wing right down into our tub. And we worried about it for a while, and then we finally just made jokes about it and kept our spirits up that way. Again, figuring that if anything hit in this aft spot of aircraft, we'd be in trouble. Again, the aft view of the flight deck showing the aircraft that were parked there, the ones we later on had to dump over the side. Here's some night action. There's an aircraft hit, burning. Those big flashes that occasionally occur were the 5-inch anti-aircraft guns, and they made a horrendous racket. The Bismarck C had smaller anti-aircraft guns, mostly 20 millimeter, but they fired a lot faster. So when that ship was all the guns firing, it really was a 4th of July type affair. It lit up the whole sky. And when they would get an airplane, they'd all converge on a spot, and then the aircraft would burst into flame. You can see the blast of the 5-inch 38s there.
Doesn't really look as though we knew what we were shooting at, does it? I'm not sure we did. Some of the gunners just fired out a nervous energy when someone else started shooting. Well, that's the story of the Saratoga's last battle, and I know it must have dragged for some of you a little bit. I don't think it dragged for Tom. As a postscript, the Saratoga was repaired in only about a month, amazing as it may seem, and sent back out, but never again saw action. At the end of, or some years after the end of the war, it was sacrificed in a nuclear weapons test and now sits on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean courtesy of our own armed forces. Right after the battle, when we got back to the States, I went back east and married Bev, and we went on to have Susan and David, and they went on to have David and Matthew and Jeffrey, and so the families live on. Tom and Lois had a good-sized family of their own and now grandchildren. Tom was a successful businessman in California, and I was mostly in the aerospace industry for all of my life. Bev and I had a great life together. I was very lucky to get her in the first place, and we had some exciting and eventful years. And Iwo Jima just celebrated its 50th, and we just celebrated our 50th. And that's the end of my story.